Car Magazine spent 16 years laughing at this engine. The engine spent the next 30 outliving the people who wrote the jokes. That is the Pontiac Iron Duke in one sentence. A motor so slow it became a punchline, and so stubborn it became hard to kill. In the 1980s, nobody looked at a 2.5-liter GM four-cylinder and saw legend. They saw the base engine, the cheap one, the rental car one, the engine you got when you could not afford the V6. And to be fair, the jokes had evidence. Depending on the year and tune, the Duke lived around the high 80s to low 90s horsepower range. It rattled, it groaned. It made sporty cars feel like they were dragging an anchor. In a Fiero, it looked especially ridiculous. Mid-engine shape, wedge body, exotic promise. And then the starter turned over what sounded like a farm pump under the deck lid. But the mistake was judging it by the wrong scoreboard. The Iron Duke was never built to win a drag race, seduce a magazine editor, or make a Pontiac feel European. It was built to start, idle, heat up, cool down, haul, stop, and do it again after everyone had stopped caring. The laugh was real, so was the survival. In 1977, General Motors was not designing from a position of confidence. The fuel crisis had changed the entire emotional temperature of the American car business. Pontiac, a division that had built much of its identity around V8 torque and muscle-era swagger, suddenly needed something very different. A four-cylinder engine that could be cheap to build, cheap to run, and tough enough to serve across the bottom half of GM's lineup. That is where the Iron Duke begins. Not as an exciting idea, but as a defensive one. On a Pontiac engineering bench in 1977, the object itself told you what kind of problem GM was trying to solve. A cast iron block, a cast iron head, overhead valves, 2 valves per cylinder, 5 main bearings holding the crankshaft. Nothing about it screamed future. Nothing about it looked delicate, exotic, or clever in the way the 1970s had learned to fear, after engines like the aluminum block Vega 4 gave GM a very public lesson in what happens when lightness arrives before durability. The Duke went the other direction. It accepted weight. It accepted old architecture. It accepted that a little more iron was cheaper than a lot more warranty work. That is the first thing the jokes usually miss. The Iron Duke was not crude because nobody knew how to make something more sophisticated. It was crude because GM was trying to build a four-cylinder that could survive American neglect. Bad oil change habits, heat, short trips, fleet drivers, cheap maintenance. Owners who would never open the hood until a light came on. A more elegant engine might have looked better in a brochure. This one looked better after 150,000 miles of being treated like an appliance. By 1982, GM even tried to dress it up. Fuel injection arrived. The name Tech Avor appeared, which was almost funny because the engine underneath still felt like the opposite of high-tech. Consumer Guide notes that the Tech 4 update brought electronic fuel injection and a vibration-reducing balance shaft, a serious attempt to make the old workhorse feel less agricultural without changing its basic mission. The mission stayed the same: low cost, low speed, low drama. Then came the horsepower problem. The early Iron Duke was never powerful, and later versions were only slightly less embarrassing. Jalopnik's history of the engine lists the early output at 87 horsepower and 128 pound-feet of torque, numbers that explain both the ridicule and the misunderstanding. The torque figure mattered in daily use. The horsepower figure mattered in magazines. That difference destroyed its reputation. Put the Duke in a basic commuter car, and it made a kind of rough sense. Put it in a Chevrolet Citation with a manual transmission, and you had ordinary transportation with decent fuel economy. Put it in a fleet sedan, and it could spend its life doing boring work for people who did not care what the tachometer said. Put it in a Fiero, and suddenly the same engine became comedy. The 1984 Pontiac Fiero looked like a miniature exotic, but Car and Driver later summed up the problem neatly. The 2.5-litre Iron Duke made only 92 horsepower, and even in a car weighing around 2,580 pounds, the performance was underwhelming. 0 to 60 took 11.3 seconds, and the quarter mile took 17.8 seconds at 74 empathy. Those numbers are not misunderstood genius. They are slow. The fair counter-argument has to be said once. The Iron Duke hurt some cars. In a Camaro or Firebird, it made the badge feel cheap. In a Fiero, it helped create the gap between what the car looked like and what it could actually do. And the Fiero's early fire reputation was not imaginary either. The first-year four-cylinder cars had real issues around oil capacity, connecting rods, and heat management. So this is not a rescue mission where every criticism was wrong. The criticism was aimed at the wrong center. The Duke's gift was never speed, it was tolerance. That sounds small until you see where the engine ended up. In 1985, at a test course in Laredo, Texas, the US Postal Service put 3 prototype delivery vehicles through 24,000 miles of endurance and maneuverability testing. This was not a romantic automotive setting. No mountain road, no racetrack, no glossy launch event. Just heat, stops, turns, cargo, doors, repeated abuse, and the kind of duty cycle that quietly murders vehicles. The Smithsonian National Postal Museum says the Postal Service wanted a weather-tight aluminum-bodied truck that could be easy to enter and exit for carriers ranging from 4'11" to 6'2", and, most importantly, could run 20 hours a day, 7 days a week, month after month, year after year. Grumman won with the long-life vehicle, using a body by Grumman and a chassis by General Motors. USPS ordered 19,150 of them. That sentence changes the Iron Duke story. Because once the Duke went into the Grumman LLV, it was no longer being tested by magazine writers. It was being tested by federal routine. Every curbside stop became a starter, cooling, oiling, and heat soak event. Every neighborhood route became a low-speed torture loop. The engine was not asked to impress anyone. It was asked to disappear into the work. That may be the hardest job a cheap engine can get. The Government Accountability Office later described the LLVs as custom-built, right-hand drive delivery trucks with aluminum bodies, GM chassis, and 4-cylinder gasoline engines, acquired from 1987 through 1994, with an expected operational life of 24 years. They carried 1,000 pounds with 108 cubic feet of cargo space. 24 years was already ambitious. Then the trucks kept going. By fiscal year 2019, the USPS Office of Inspector General reported that the Postal Service still had 141,057 LLVs and spent $706.2 million maintaining them that year. The average maintenance cost was about $5,000 per vehicle, and the fleet was already 25 to 32 years old. That is not a fairy tale about a perfect truck. It is something more interesting. A flawed, obsolete, uncomfortable vehicle that was still useful enough to keep alive long after its planned retirement. The Duke was part of that story. Not the whole story. The aluminum body mattered. The GM light truck chassis mattered. The simplicity of the package mattered. But under the hood, the same basic personality that made the Iron Duke boring in a showroom made it valuable in a mail route. Low stress, cheap parts, familiar service, no glamour to protect. The empire of the Iron Duke was strange because it crossed social classes inside the car world. It sat in base Pontiacs, Chevrolets, Buicks, and Oldsmobiles. It appeared in the Fiero, where people wanted it to be something it was not. It appeared in S10 pickups, where slow suddenly became acceptable because trucks are forgiven for being tools. It even found its way into Camaros and Firebirds, which is still one of the most emotionally confusing combinations GM ever sold. A pony car with an Iron Duke under the hood was not really a performance car. It was a finance plan with a long hood. The engine also reached beyond Pontiac's own showroom. Histories of the 2.5 note that it was supplied to AMC and used across a wide spread of GM applications, which is why so many mechanics of a certain generation remember seeing it everywhere. It was not beloved. It was common, and common engines build a different kind of power. Junkyards knew them, parts counters knew them, fleet shops knew them. A mechanic could hate the sound and still appreciate how quickly the thing came apart. Then there was the weird performance footnote, the Super Duty version. Pontiac Motorsports took the humble Duke architecture and turned it into a racing 4-cylinder family for series like NASCAR's Charlotte in Daytona Dash, IMSA classes, Arce, and even American Powerboat Association Racing. That did not mean the stock engine in your base Fiero was secretly a race motor. It meant the architecture had more strength hiding inside it than its street tune suggested. That is why the Iron Duke story keeps splitting in two. Owners who wanted refinement remember noise. Drivers who wanted power remember disappointment. Fleet operators and mechanics remember something else. Access, parts, iron, and the comforting fact that the engine usually failed slowly, noisily, and repairably. Modern engines can fail like electronics. The Duke failed like machinery. You could hear it complain. That matters because the engine's crudeness was not just personality. It was mechanical policy. A cast iron block and head made it heavier than it needed to be, but they also made it forgiving. An overhead valve layout kept the valve train simple. Modest compression reduced stress. The engine's low RPM tuning meant it did not need to live near redline to do its normal work. The 5-main bearing crank support was conservative in the best sense of the word. Even the old-school feel had a purpose. Fewer delicate systems, fewer expensive surprises, less dependence on perfect behavior from the owner. Of course, simple does not mean flawless. The Iron Duke could shake. It could eat timing gears. It could sound broken while running normally. Some versions were better than others. Some installations, especially early Fieros, gave the engine a harsher reputation than the basic design deserved. But the deepest truth is almost insulting. The Duke survived partly because it was never ambitious enough to destroy itself. It did not chase high specific output. It did not chase smoothness at any cost. It did not try to make a base compact feel premium. It took the shame of being slow and converted that shame into margin. Thermal margin, mechanical margin, maintenance margin. The kind of margin that never wins a comparison test, but shows up when a vehicle has to start again tomorrow. That is the last laugh. The Iron Duke was mocked because the public wanted engines to be aspirational. A motor should make a car feel faster, richer, more sophisticated, more alive. The Duke did almost none of that. It made cars feel cheaper. It made sporty badges feel dishonest. It reminded buyers, every time they merged onto a highway, that they had chosen the bottom of the order sheet. Then time changed the scoreboard. The engines people praised for refinement disappeared into expensive failures, obsolete electronics, or cars too costly to keep alive. The Iron Duke stayed in back lots, postal depots, farm towns, delivery routes, old S10s, strange swaps, and half-forgotten Fieros that still turned over after sitting too long. It was not great in the glamorous sense. It was great in the industrial sense. That distinction is why the Iron Duke deserves a second reading. GM did not accidentally build a secret performance legend. It built a cheap 4-cylinder during a desperate period, made conservative choices, installed it in too many vehicles, embarrassed itself a few times, and still ended up with one of the most stubborn engines of its era. The magazines were not wrong when they said it was slow. They were wrong about what mattered. Because 30 years later, when a Grumman LLV rolled down another street with peeling paint, no air conditioning, sliding doors, and a tired 4-cylinder clattering away under the hood, it was making an argument no road test could answer. The engine did not need respect to do its job. It just needed fuel, spark, oil, and one more route. Did you own an Iron Duke? Drop the mileage in the comments, especially if yours survived something it had no business surviving. GM's cheapest, slowest engine refused to die. But in the very same showrooms, their most ambitious gamble was doing the exact opposite. That disaster is next. The engine that killed diesel in America. The Oldsmobile 350 full story.